Hi, I'm Barbara Bowley, and this is Ask the Edge, hosted by theTournamentEdge.net. With me is my co-host, Anthony Trezza. How are you, Anthony?
I'm doing great, Barbara. How are you?
Doing fine. You know, our normal format is to take a question about horse racing tournaments from our viewers every week, and this week we've had a plethora of questions on the same topic, and that's about the issue that happened this past week in New York regarding the Attorney General there issuing a cease and desist order prohibiting some of the major fantasy gaming sites from accepting entries from their customers. A lot of our viewers play on those sites, and a lot of our viewers are horse racing tournament contestants. Both of those viewers have questions. They want to know whether or not it's going to be legal for them to continue their activities in New York State in particular, and in Nevada secondarily. And we're privileged to have one of the top legal experts on internet gaming with us for an interview, and his name is John Ford. He is the CEO of BAM Software and Services, LLC. He's going to give us a perspective that I think you'll find is fascinating and actually might clear the waters quite a lot on what is likely to happen over the next 6 months in regard to this issue. So we sat down with John, and he gave us a fabulous interview, Anthony, and I'd like to share that with the audience.
That'd be great. Let's go right to your interview, Barbara. It's fascinating and definitely groundbreaking.
Today we have our very special guest, John Ford, who is CEO of BAM Software and Services, and one of the platforms that you're probably all very familiar with that resides at BAM Software and Services is Bet America. And our customers and clients have some questions about what's happening in the environment of fantasy gaming right now and how that'll affect horse racing tournaments. And John is an expert in this area, in the legal aspect of gaming, and has a lot of things to say about what we can expect in the future, and has participated in many venues in this arena. So, John, I wanted to ask you, what is your initial take on some of the things that have been happening lately in states such as Nevada and New York as we speak in early to mid-November of 2015?
Yeah, well, it's great to be here, Barbara. And I would say that I've just been amazed at the swirling controversy that has erupted around fantasy sports just in the last 2 months. You know, fantasy sports season long has been around for a long, long time. Daily fantasy's been around for a number of years. And it never ceases to amaze me how something that was fairly routine up until this point has now turned into just a swirling controversy of different people taking different views of what's been going on. I was just going to say that it is interesting, and I think it's good to keep in mind that everybody looks at this issue from their own perspective. And keeping in mind their own self-interest, if you want. I do the same. I happen to have fairly firm views of what's going on in the industry, but other people do too. And so New Jersey, who's been fighting for sports betting to be legal throughout the U.S., they certainly have an interest. Those stakeholders certainly have an interest in creating controversy and trying to bring their cause forward, and are using, fantasy as a tool to do that. Nevada, who, their operators obviously got left behind in the explosion of daily fantasy, and are now thinking that maybe other people shouldn't be doing it. So I'm sure they had a voice with their regulators in the decision of the Nevada Gaming Board that was issued a couple weeks ago. Everybody has a vested interest. I even hear that the Attorney General in New York might want to be governor of New York someday. So everybody has an interest, and I think it's good to keep that in mind as we listen to people's views on these matters.
Well, I think we all understand that there's a political element and a legal element to what we're looking at in this arena. Do you see pushback on the part of the major stakeholders in the fantasy gaming industry? And do you think that pushback is going to be successful? They certainly seem to have quite a wide base of economic support and fan support. What's your take on that potential there?
Yeah, so from what I've seen so far of the two companies that got the letters, that they do intend to oppose the efforts of the Attorney General to stop their activities in the state of New York, and I believe they should. After looking at the New York Attorney General's letter, I can't help but think that that view is not going to carry the day. I'm not giving legal advice to anybody, but it just seems more a political letter to me than really a close analysis of the gambling law in New York and whether daily fantasy sports violates that law.
Interesting. Now, how does daily fantasy sports differ from horse racing contests that many of our fans and clients are engaged in on a regular basis, and through your platform, Bet America, are very interested in and want to know about the future of that area in fantasy sports? How does it differ from traditional daily fantasy sports?
Yeah, great question. So handicapping contests have been around for horse racing for literally decades. Started at racetracks where tracks would offer the opportunity for customers to enter a contest, win a prize. They'd also go and make pari-mutuel wagers into the commingled pools at the racetrack. It's been supported and sponsored by the racing industry literally for decades. There is a general view that it's good for the industry because contests increase the engagement with racing, results in more pari-mutuel wagers going into the pool, which benefits the track and benefits horsemen at the track. And so what we've done on the handicapping contest side is to provide that opportunity online, where people can make pari-mutuel wagers, and they can also enter contests. On our side, we think that the handicapping contests on horse racing create a good entry point for beginners to be interested in horse racing. The rules are simpler. You know what the prize is going to be. You know how many people you're competing against, and so it's a place that you can enter into horse racing where the rules are very simple and very clear, as opposed to making a pick three wager that you have no idea what your prize is going to be. You know that you have to pick the winners of 3 consecutive races, but the outcome is dependent upon how many other people agree with you and make those selections, and so you don't really know what the prize is going to be. You don't know how many people you're competing against. You don't know how big the pool is going to be. So it takes more knowledge and experience to venture into pari-mutuel wagering than it does in the contest. So the handicapping contest certainly takes skill and knowledge, but the rules are very clear, and we think it's a great entry point for horse racing. When you compare that to fantasy sports, it's something completely different. Fantasy sports grew out of the rotisserie leagues of baseball that then developed season-long contests, and then were really kind of given a stamp of approval under the UEJA legislation back in 2006, the Unlawful Internet Gambling Enforcement Act, which set down very precise definition of what fantasy sports was. And that was actually lobbied hard for by the major leagues, who see it as a great resource for their fans. And so there's certain requirements in fantasy sports contests. The prize is set in advance. It's not dependent upon the number of players in the contest. The results reflect the knowledge and skill of the participants. The outcome is determined by the accumulation of statistical data from the different events. And so the rules were kind of set out very clearly as to what fantasy sports were. It never defined any length of time. It never said it had to be season long, or it could only be one day, or it had to be more than one day. There was no time component. It's basically it has to be more than a single event that the players participate in. And so those rules at the federal level for fantasy really guide what one can do in fantasy sports. And then, there's a whole different question about state law with regard to fantasy sports on baseball and basketball and football, which I'm sure we'll get into and talk about a little.
So the states do have jurisdiction over federal and UEJA issues. So they can.
Well, yeah, I think the better way to think of it, and I'm not giving legal advice, but the better way to think of it is that one should look at the federal laws and see whether you're compliant or not, and then one should look at the state law to see whether you're compliant with state law. And the examination of federal law is relatively straightforward because UEJA kind of set the requirements down. When you look at state law, it's a lot different. So, when the anti-gambling statutes were passed in most states, no one had a concept of what fantasy sports would be.
This was what some of us may know as Black Friday, when the poker sites were taken down and so forth, when that kind of decision changed.
The UEJA legislation passed, yeah. So the UEJA legislation did more than fantasy sports. It also tried to prevent the transfer of monies, assisting in entering unlawful internet gambling sites, and so that was its main target. But it exempted out of that legislation the fantasy sports, and also exempted out horse racing, for that matter. So the federal analysis for fantasy sports is pretty straightforward. On the state law, it's a little bit harder because fantasy sports wasn't contemplated when all these states passed their anti-gambling laws. And the majority of them say that it's illegal to bet on the outcome of a sporting event. And so that's what the statutes say. And so you look at it and you say, okay, well, fantasy sports is really not determined by the outcome of a sporting event. It's really determined based upon the accumulated statistical data of players performing in events, and don't really care who wins the event or not. It's really how individuals perform. And so it's a little hard to utilize those state gambling laws to say that fantasy sports on baseball and basketball and football are illegal, because it wasn't contemplated. The Attorney General of New York has tried to make an argument that it was, but I think that argument is not the best argument there is. And I think that what seems to be more interest for the folks who have raised a question is really from a consumer protection standpoint. And he makes a point in his letter that people should be protected against, people dealing with inside information, or, people not having a fair chance to win. And I think those are all valid points, and obviously believe strongly that everybody should have a level playing field. But I'm not sure that those consumer protection interests really make the game illegal. In fact, I don't think they do at all. They don't have any relevance to whether or not the game that's offered is illegal. But I do think consumer protection is a valid point, and I do expect that some states will pass consumer protection laws to make sure that the players' funds are protected and people don't have an inside advantage. And I'm sure with all this controversy, there'll be some states that'll go down that route of providing some protection for consumers. But that concern doesn't make the game illegal.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. What is your stance going to be at Bet America with your contests? Do you have a particular set of guidelines in place yet, or are you waiting to see what happens in New York?
So we've always had guidelines in place, and to understand how we operate, you should understand that we come from a regulated background. So horse racing is highly regulated in the states. We have contracts with all the racetracks that we accept wagers on. We're regulated by the California Horse Racing Board, the Kentucky Horse Racing Commission, the North Dakota Racing Commission. There's a whole number of bodies that have oversight over our activity. So we're accustomed to a regulatory environment. And I've said from the beginning that I've always thought that fantasy would eventually have some oversight because there, even though I don't believe it's gambling, there is cash, there is sports, and there's winning prizes. And in that situation, one would reasonably expect that some states will have an interest in looking after that activity. So from our personal standpoint, I'm happy with regulation. It actually makes things simpler because you know exactly what the rules are instead of making a legal opinion of what the rules are. So from our standpoint, we've always had guidelines that we operate under. We review the states that we offer our different games on a regular basis, and we're constantly monitoring developments as they occur, and they certainly are occurring frequently these days on the fantasy sports side. But in particular reference to New York, we've not made any change on fantasy sports for New York. I think one of for a couple of reasons. One is that there were certain companies that were directed to cease and desist from accepting customers in New York, and we were not one of them. But secondly, the concerns that were expressed in the Attorney General's letter are not the type of games that we offer. So what seemed particularly concerning to the New York Attorney General's office, it wasn't season long. He had no issue with season long, even though they do profit from what he thinks is gambling. But since they don't principally profit from what he thinks is gambling, then season long seems to be okay by the office. But what he seemed to be particularly concerned about are these very large games of hundreds of thousands of players that he believed people didn't have a chance at winning, and that it was deceptive to create the idea that this was a lottery, it gave the appearance of a lottery that you could submit an entry and you could win $1 million this weekend. And he seemed to be particularly interested in kind of what he thought of as a deceptive practice from the operators that he sent the letter to. And we don't operate any of those types of games. We have 5 people playing in a contest, or 10 people, or 20 people, or 50 people, but we don't have these multi-million-dollar games that are being offered that he seemed to take particular offense to. So I don't think that letter is addressed to companies operating like us. If he would send me a letter, we would certainly comply. We're built to comply with law and regulations. It's what we do. So but I don't think that the type of activity that it complained about is not anything that we do.
That's very comforting news to our horse racing tournament fans. I think it brings an awful lot of clarity that didn't exist prior to this interview and prior to your.
Well, and I think it's important when I talk about the Attorney General's letter. I'm really talking about fantasy sports on baseball, basketball, football. Handicapping contests really completely different. Horse racing has used handicapping contests for decades. All of our commissions are very familiar with it. We use it as a marketing tool to increase pari-mutuel handle. We actually went out to all of our racetracks that participate in handicapping contests and got their agreement that they would agree that we could use the races at their tracks as part of the events that we offer on the handicapping contest. So very different analysis than what's going on in the New York Attorney General's letter. So there is a bright line between these daily fantasy big contests that offer millions of dollars on football and handicapping contests, which we'll offer and continue to offer.
That brings us an awful lot of clarity, John. Much appreciated. Is there anything else you'd like to add regarding this environment and what the future holds, or?
Yeah, I guess I would just say one thing is that, and I was on a call with someone else today where I think this will get more frothy before it gets less excited. We're in for more news and more attention to this. We haven't seen the peak of attention. From what I understand, the folks who received the New York Attorney General's letter are going to contest that opinion that he has, and so that will get news, I'm sure, and that battle will continue and be newsworthy. I also suspect that other states will look at what's going on with fantasy sports and make some decisions about the direction that they want to go. So I do think there'll be more noise going on before it gets quieter. But I do think that what will happen eventually, 6 months, 8 months down the road, is that we'll have some states that become comfortable with fantasy, daily fantasy, and will go back to what they were doing before the daily fantasy whirlwind began. There are some states that will look at it and think, we do need to get something on the books from a consumer protection standpoint, and I do expect some states to go down that route. And I think there'll be a few states that'll say, no, we think this is better managed from a gaming law standpoint, and we're going to redefine our laws to include daily fantasy as a regulated activity, and we're going to license it and regulate it that way. And so I think those will be the minority. I think the majority will be comfortable with what's been going on, and there'll be a few that'll go down the consumer protection route, and things will get quieter in 2016, mid 2016 than it is today. But so we're going to have to weather a bit more controversy in the coming months, because it's just a great subject, right? It's got money, it's got sports, it's got the Nevada casino companies, it's got New Jersey trying to get legalized sports betting, it's got consumer protection, it's got attorney generals maybe running for governor in 2018. It's got a lot of things out there that are newsworthy. So I'm sure we'll be hearing a lot about it.
Oh, we'd love to continue to hear your perspective, because it's a fascinating and informed one, and it's brought a lot of very important information to people who've had many questions. So I want to thank you so much for coming on and speaking with us on the Tournament Edge. And maybe we'll see you in 6 months when things quiet down, or maybe we'll see you in the middle of the froth. I don't know. But thank you very much again, John Ford,
Yep.
CEO of BAMSIS, and we hope your continued success is part of the future for all of us who play horse racing tournaments. So thank you.
Very good. Nice speaking with you, Barbara.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Well, we certainly appreciate John's time and his expertise, and he's drawn a clear line for me as a player. I play in tournaments on a daily basis in horse racing contests, and I know this is a game of skill. I know that I need handicapping skills, strategic skills, physicality handicapping skills, all the kinds of things that we teach here on the tournamentedge.net. Anthony, what's your take?
Well, I've played on both ends. I've played on the fantasy sports end of it for many years, and now I've crossed over to the fantasy horse racing, or the contest world of horse racing. And so, I know that how much time all of our tournament players put into selecting horses and figuring out all the statistics that go into a contest card. It is not a pick and run type of situation like a lottery. It's more of a game of it's not a static game. It's an ever-changing game, and it changes within minutes in horse racing. So. There's so many different ways to approach it, and so many different areas to approach it, and so many variables And yeah, I do believe both worlds, the fantasy sports world and the contest world in horse racing, is surely a game of skill.
Anthony, thank you. And if you have any questions, feel free to email us at contact@thetournamentedge.net.